A rock legend ends up lifeless in his own pool, and almost nothing about that night makes sense. Brian Jones' death was ruled an accident, but fractured witness stories, lost details, and whispers of guilt suggest something far darker. And here's where the story really begins. Long before stadiums, scandals, and headlines, Brian Jones didn't start as a rock star cliché. He grew up surrounded by classical music, the kind that trains your ear early, the kind that sticks with you. But as a teenager, his attention drifted far from polished concert halls. He fell hard for American blues, raw, aching records from artists like Robert Johnson and Elmore James. Music that sounded broken, honest, and alive. Then jazz hit him. Hearing Cannonball Adderley changed everything. Jones begged his parents for a saxophone and actually got one, throwing himself into it with obsession-level focus. But it didn't stop there. Guitar followed, then more instruments. Brian wasn't just learning songs, he was collecting sounds. By his late teens, he was busking across Europe, playing on streets, scraping by on odd jobs, and chasing music wherever it led. No safety net, no backup plan, just talent, hunger, and an almost restless need to play. This wasn't someone chasing fame. This was someone who needed music. And that hunger, it's exactly what pulled the Rolling Stones into existence, and this is where chaos turns into history. Brian Jones placed a simple ad in Jazz News, calling musicians to the Bricklayers Arms pub. Nothing flashy, just an audition. The first connections formed fast, but everything clicked when Mick Jagger walked in, soon followed by his childhood friend, Keith Richards. They bonded instantly over blues records, not ambition, not fame, just the music. Then came the name. While placing another ad, Brian glanced down at a Muddy Waters album lying on the floor. One track jumped out. Rolling Stone Blues. That was it. No committee meeting, no branding strategy, just instinct. After cycling through bass players, Bill Wyman earned his spot with sheer practicality. Charlie Watts followed soon after. By early 1963, the lineup was locked. And make no mistake, at this point, this was Brian's band. He booked shows, led rehearsals, and shaped the sound. The Stones didn't exist around Brian Jones. They existed because of him. This is where things started slipping out of Brian's hands. Enter Andrew Loog Oldham and Eric Easton, two men who understood image as much as music. They didn't just manage the Stones, they redesigned them. Suits were replaced with attitude. The goal was clear: position the Stones as the dangerous alternative to the Beatles. Decca Records took the gamble, and it paid off fast. The debut album shot straight to #1 in the UK. The US followed. Surveys suddenly showed the Stones outpacing the Beatles in popularity. The machine was rolling. But behind the scenes, control was shifting. Oldham pushed Mick Jagger and Keith Richards to write more originals. The spotlight narrowed. Brian still contributed musically, textures, arrangements, odd instruments, but the center was moving. The band was winning. Brian Jones, slowly, was being edged out of the picture. And here's where it turns uncomfortable. Oldham quietly replaced Brian as the band's leader, steering decisions through Jagger and Richards. Mick became the face, the voice, the movement, the focus of every live show. The blues-heavy sound Brian loved was fading, replaced by sharper pop-rock ambitions. Brian felt it. Everyone did. As money and fame flooded in, his behavior grew unpredictable. Drugs and alcohol weren't side habits anymore. They were constant companions. Bill Wyman later described it best. Two Brians. One is shy, thoughtful, and deeply sensitive. The other was loud, desperate for validation, and unraveling in real time. Sessions became tense. Relationships frayed. Brian wasn't just losing influence, he was losing his place. And once that sense of belonging cracks, especially for someone wired like Brian Jones, the damage doesn't stay contained. It spreads, quietly, relentlessly. Just when it seemed like Brian might find solid ground again, everything slipped further. A trip to Morocco briefly reignited his curiosity. He became obsessed with exotic instruments, unusual sounds, and anything that could pull him somewhere new. You can still hear traces of that on Beggar's Banquet, textures only Brian could bring, but his role was shrinking fast. On Let It Bleed, his contributions were minimal. He wasn't unreliable anymore. He was barely present. Then came the final blow. Brian Jones was officially dismissed from the Rolling Stones. No dramatic announcement, just done. 20-year-old Mick Taylor stepped in almost immediately. After years of building the band from nothing, Brian was out, watching from the sidelines as the group he created moved on without him. And that moment? That's the line between rock history and a tragedy that was about to unfold. And this part feels almost cruel in hindsight. After being pushed out of the Stones, Brian Jones retreated to Cotchford Farm, a quiet farmhouse in East Sussex he'd bought months earlier. Once A.A. Milne's home was meant to be a refuge, away from cameras, pressure, and the band that no longer wanted him. He pulled back from public life completely. No tours, no interviews, just space. And surprisingly, there were signs of renewal. Brian talked about forming a new band. He played demos. Old friends noticed a shift. Alexis Corner visited and later said Brian seemed happier than he'd been in years. Calmer, focused, almost relieved. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense that Brian might start over on his own terms. Less noise, more control, more music. That's what makes what comes next so unsettling. Because just as hope crept back in, everything stopped. Permanently. And here's where unfamiliar names suddenly matter a lot. Brian hired Tom Keylock, a former Stones associate, as a kind of fixer, someone to manage day-to-day issues at the farm. Renovations were supposed to be part of the plan, which led to the arrival of a builder named Frank Thorogood. But little actual work got done. Instead, Thorogood and his crew practically moved in. They partied on Brian's dime, lived on the property, and drained money freely. Brian, already fragile, didn't push back at first, but eventually he noticed the numbers didn't add up. Reports say he'd already paid thousands of pounds. Thorogood demanded more. That's when tensions rose. Arguments, accusations, a growing sense that Brian felt used in his own home. And when money, resentment, and intoxication mix, especially around people who shouldn't be trusted, it's never just background noise. It's a warning sign. And then comes the night everything fractures. June 3rd, 1969. No wild party, just a small group. Brian, his girlfriend Anna Wolin, nurse Janet Lawson, and Frank Thorogood. Alcohol was flowing. Drugs were present. The mood wasn't celebratory. It was loose, heavy, and unfocused. At some point, Brian ended up in the swimming pool. Accounts differ immediately. Who went in with him? Who stayed behind? Who was watching? What is clear is that near midnight, Brian Jones was found motionless at the bottom of the pool. By the time help arrived, it was too late. But here's the problem. The timeline never settled. Witnesses disagreed on what happened minutes before his body was discovered. Key moments blurred. Details shifted. And when a death depends on those missing minutes, confusion isn't just suspicious, it's everything. The conclusion came fast, almost too fast. The coroner ruled Brian Jones's death a death by misadventure. The report cited an enlarged heart and liver, damaged by years of drug and alcohol abuse. Bottles of alcohol and pills were found at the scene, reinforcing the narrative. Early reports even suggested an asthma attack, possibly triggered by pollen, while he was swimming. Case closed, except it didn't feel closed. Police acknowledged multiple witnesses were present, yet their stories didn't line up. Evidence handling raised questions. Key details were glossed over. No one was charged. No deep reconstruction of events followed. For a global rock star, the investigation felt strangely shallow. And once that verdict was stamped, everything else, doubts, inconsistencies, unanswered questions, was pushed quietly aside. And this is where the story really starts unraveling. Janet Lawson, the nurse present that night, initially claimed Brian and Frank Thorogood went into the pool together after drinking and taking drugs. Later, she changed her story, saying they were just horsing around, hinting the incident may have been accidental. Anna Wolin told a different version. She said she pulled Brian from the pool herself and briefly felt his hand grip hers. But even her account raised questions about timing and awareness. So who was actually in the pool with Brian? Who saw him last, alive? That answer never stabilized. Every retelling shifted slightly. Small details contradicted earlier statements. Critical moments blurred instead of sharpening with time. And when witnesses can't agree on the final moments of someone's life, one question hangs heavy. Was this confusion, or was something being hidden? And this is the theory most people circle back to. Frank Thorogood wasn't just a builder. He was a man Brian believed was bleeding him dry. Brian had already paid a huge sum for renovation work that barely existed. When Thorogood demanded even more money, things turned tense fast. Friends later said Brian was done being taken advantage of. That night, alcohol and drugs were already in play. According to one version of events, Brian confronted Thorogood near the pool. Voices were raised, tempers flared, and in that moment, whether out of rage, panic, or desperation, Thorogood allegedly pushed Brian's head underwater. Not a long struggle, just long enough. What keeps this theory alive is what allegedly came years later. In 1993, as Thorogood lay dying, he supposedly confessed to Tom Keelock, saying, "It was me that did Brian, I just finally snapped." A sentence that's been repeated, disputed, and argued over ever since. Then came the 2005 film Stoned, which dramatized this version of events and pushed the story into mainstream culture. Police allegedly wanted to pursue manslaughter charges, but were ordered to drop them due to mistakes made early in the case. If true, the goal wasn't justice, it was containment. So the question becomes unsettling. Was Brian Jones's death simply convenient for people in power? And here's where science quietly raises its hand. The coroner's report mentioned something that never sat right: fresh water in Brian Jones's lungs. Not chlorine-heavy pool water. Fresh water. This raised a chilling possibility. Brian may have drowned somewhere else on the property before being placed in the pool. Even more troubling, later reviews by biologists suggested stress indicators in his heart and tissues, signs consistent with someone fighting for their life, not peacefully slipping away. There were no thorough reconstructions, no deep forensic follow-ups. Key details were logged, then ignored. Why? If this were a simple accident, those findings would strengthen the case. Instead, they complicated it. And complicated evidence tends to vanish when it threatens a clean narrative. Fresh water, signs of struggle, no clear explanation. Sometimes it's not what investigators find. It's what they choose not to pursue that tells the real story. And finally, the theories no one ever really chased. Some whispered that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards visited Brian before his death, pressuring him to sign over rights to the Rolling Stones' name. It's a theory that never gained traction. No investigation, no follow-up, no confirmation, just silence. And that silence raises a bigger question. Why was nothing pursued aggressively? Not Thorogood, not Keelock, not police negligence, not anyone. Multiple reviews over the years, 1984, 1994, and 2009, all concluded the same thing. No reason to reopen the case. But here's the thing. Those reviews relied on the same original evidence, the same contradictions, the same missing pieces. So after all these years, the mystery doesn't survive because of wild imagination. It survives because too many questions were never answered. Just 2 days after Brian Jones died, the Rolling Stones took the stage at Hyde Park. The concert became something else entirely, a public farewell. Jagger read Shelley's Adonai, Butterflies were released, and Brian's absence hung heavy over the crowd. Years later, in 1989, Jones was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with the band. Jagger described Brian as a musician whose individuality often pushed them off course, with often marvelous results. Over time, Brian's image shifted. No longer just the troubled member, but the creative spark that started it all. The case never stayed buried. Fan clubs kept pushing, journalists kept digging, new dossiers were handed to police again and again. Sussex police reviewed the case in 1984, 1994, and 2009. Each time, the conclusion was the same: no grounds to overturn the original verdict. And yet, the doubts remain. Confessions, contradictions, missing evidence, untouched leads. The verdict stands not because every question was answered, but because none were chased hard enough to change it. Brian Jones helped create one of the greatest bands in music history. Yet his final night remains tangled in silence and suspicion. Accident or murder, the truth slipped beneath the surface with him. So what do you think happened? Drop your thoughts below, and if this story hooked you, like and subscribe.